Thanks, Dan. Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks, all of you, for coming tonight. Thanks to the Stewart School for hosting this event. I've had a great time interacting with kids and teachers all day today. I began the day by telling first graders that I had 2 Saturdays and 2 Sundays this weekend. I was in Singapore and Hong Kong last week and flew back to Los Angeles via Guam and Honolulu, and then had a meeting Monday morning that I forgot about in Los Angeles and flew here last night. So I'm looking forward to sleeping, but I don't know when that's going to actually happen. And just to correct the record a little bit, some of the publicity for the event listed me as the co-founder of the Maker Movement, which is kind of funny to be a founder of a movement. And when I was in Amsterdam about a month ago, there were a number of Europeans who introduced me as the father of the Maker Movement, and I said, I prefer creepy uncle. So I'm going to talk about some trends and some opportunities that exist outside of schools and that I've been actively engaged in trying to bring to schools long before anyone was talking about a Maker Movement. My partner and I did indeed co-author a book called Invent to Learn, Making Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom, where we tried to take this informal learning revolution that's taking place outside of schools and situate it in the classroom in a historical and theoretical context that made sense. And it made me a bit of an overnight sensation, despite having spent the last almost 34 years advocating for learning by doing. I led professional development in the first 2 schools in the world where every kid had a laptop. That was 25 years ago. I created one of the first online master's degree programs. I ran one of the first computer programs for camp programs for kids 3 decades ago. And I've always been about using computers to amplify human potential, to use the computer as an intellectual laboratory and vehicle for self-expression that would take the ideas we put into it and go further than we could go on our own. And this Maker Movement that I'm going to speak about is only relevant to me insofar as it's a way of increasing opportunity for kids. It's making the world a better place for kids. The images that are going by now, which I often show at the end of the presentation, are from a workshop I led at the American School of Bombay, a highly competitive elite international school in Mumbai. I led 2 Saturday morning maker workshops where when the parents were able to see through the eyes and the hands and the screens of their kids what was possible, these type A, really competitive parents demanded a different kind of educational experience for their kids, a more active, more authentic, more personal experience. So I'm going to share a number of ideas, and as Dan said, our book and some of the others that we've published are available outside. If you'd like to stay in contact and receive my very occasional newsletter, I just got the summer 2011 issue out. You can send an email of any sort to hey@stager.org. I won't read it. My robot assistant will respond, and you'll get some materials back, a digital handout. The photo on the right I took last spring at the school I work in Los Angeles, and it's of a preschooler using my current favorite educational technology, the walkie-talkie. And I brought the walkie-talkies in, and it immediately occurred to me you can build an entire K-12 curriculum that's based on listen, then talk. And there was something magical about having a walkie-talkie, and when I mentioned on social media how cool walkie-talkies were, I was barraged with a number of apps that I should look at. And I said, oh, shut up. After the walkie-talkies, we're going to use cans and string, and then we're going to bang rocks together. And my initial wise guy response to that actually has led to some more deeper thinking. And I think we ought to be using technology to either create sort of primal, primitive experiences that we think every kid should have, or to do insanely amazing things that were not even imaginable a couple of years ago. Much of what we're doing with computers is kind of in the middle, and it fails to realize the potential. That cute little kid also followed me around for about a month, asking me every day, why are you fat? Are you pregnant? When are you having a baby? And aside from asking the head of school why they were investing so much money in mindfulness and emotional intelligence if the 4-year-olds were so mean to me, I finally turned to her and said, look, I'm not taking any more abuse from someone who wears her shoes backwards. So after we made our book, we decided that was easy. We should make more books, and we started a publishing company trying to fill a void that exists. for helping teachers make this stuff happen in schools. And 3 of the 4 books are indeed available here, and I'm happy to sign our book if you're interested afterwards. Just a couple shameless plugs. I'm producing an event in Los Angeles January 4th called Reinventing Mathematics Education. That's featuring Constance Kabee, Ilana Horn, and Conrad Wolfram to not only think about the pedagogical issues about teaching mathematics more effectively, but to think about what we ought to be teaching, the actual content of it as well. And running my 9th annual Summer Institute, Constructing Modern Knowledge, where folks have 4 days uninterrupted to work with mountains of materials and amazing faculty and to reacquaint themselves with what it's like to be a learner. And we always punctuate the experience with conversations with people who are expert at what they do. And I've spent 9 years trying to bring Carla Rinaldi, the grand dame of the Reggio Emilia approach, over from Italy, and she's going to be part of the experience this year. We go to the MIT Media Lab, etc. So if you're interested, educators, you should be aware of that as well. Some of the materials that I'm going to be showing tonight and downloadable resources and free things can be found at inventtolearn.com/stuff. So I want to start with a few principles and then get into some examples of what's happening in the world and what I think it means in the classroom. The first is, we've got a problem there. This is a good test. I'm not surprised when kids do extraordinary things. I'm surprised when adults are surprised that kids are capable of doing extraordinary things. I've come to expect it. And while some people are excited that we can use the computer to teach things that we've always wanted kids to know, perhaps with greater efficiency or efficacy or comprehension, what really excites me and drives my work is the ability to use a computer to do things that were impossible otherwise, to amplify the potential of every child. The computer is this material with which you can communicate ideas, and if you're successful in your hypothesis, you test a larger hypothesis or ask a deeper question or embellish or decorate, or you're inspired to improve your work in some way. If you're unsuccessful, you're encouraged, innately to debug, to think of new strategies. And a lot of what we're doing in education with computers is reinforcing the weakest parts of school, of testing, of delivering curriculum, of monitoring kids. And a lot of the visions for technology use in schools are actually becoming quite dystopian, of monitoring children's eye motion and their heart rate and deciding whether they're engaged and then reporting to their parents at work every nanosecond what the kids are doing. I view this as a way of liberating kids, of creating opportunities that would have never existed before. Now, this is a photo I took about 23 years ago in one of the early laptop schools in Australia. The kids were programming in Logo Writer, which is a predecessor to MicroWorlds or Scratch. And if you see this kid in the center, in the time that elapsed between hitting the return key and awaiting the result to appear on his screen, every ounce of his being is mobilized in anticipation of the result. He's literally shaking with anticipation. And moments after I snapped that photo, a teacher took me aside and whispered something in my ear that has been repeated in literally hundreds of instances in classrooms around the world since. That kid's not very good at school. And I finally had an epiphany and understood what's happening here with these kids. There's an acute intensity imbalance between their ability as a learner, their sense of themselves, and the pace and the practice of the classroom. And as educators, as parents, as citizens, it's incumbent upon us to build upon kids' remarkable capacity for intensity. Otherwise, it manifests itself as boredom or ennui or misbehavior, perhaps just worst of all, wasted potential. So, we believe that kids are competent. It's my friend Jonah. I walked into his art class, he's a kindergartner, and I said, "Hey Jonah, I'll give you $1 for that painting." And he said, "I want 2. So I reached into my pocket and I said, "I have a single and a 5. And Jonah said, "I'll take the 5 and not give you any change." Research suggests that by the end of first grade, Jonah will ask, "Do I add or subtract?" That his number sense will have been completely undermined by mathematics instruction. And I want to have kids sort of learning in this natural, coercive way, and I think the maker movement that I'm going to talk about in a moment really helps sustain and nurture that. So I want to live in a world where kids wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, shaking with anticipation, as that kid you saw in a moment, where they can't wait. They're counting down the minutes to get back to school to work on something that matters to them. And I want to live in a world where teachers wake up every morning and ask themselves, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life? So, one of the things that's said in discussions of technology and education frequently is that technology changes all of the time. If only that were true in school. The sad reality is much of what we do with computers in schools today is exactly the same or less than we did with them 25 years ago. However, there are moments in history when the technology does change in a significant way. We may be in one of those moments. In our book, we identified 3 game changers: fabrication, physical computing, and programming. Fabrication is the idea that you can make physical things with a computer. And 3D printing, laser cutting are examples of that. But the amazing part about having a 3D printer in a classroom isn't that every 7th grader can print an identical Yoda keychain at great time and expense, but that we have the opportunity for the first time ever to introduce children to the Z-axis, that they can be designing in 3D, that they have the ability to engage with complex mathematical ideas in a way that was inaccessible before. Physical computing is the idea of adding interactivity and intelligence to everyday objects. We can make circuitry now out of conductive threads, so we can have a sweatshirt with directional signals on the back, and when we ride our bike home, we can indicate our turns, or we can have a necklace that alerts us when a teacher that we don't like is approaching, or make a toy that sends a text message to your friends, or you're going to see later on, send a text message to a robot that feeds your fish. This is all stuff that kids can be doing. They can make circuits as well with conductive tape and conductive ink and paint. There are kids making pianos out of bananas earlier today and Play-Doh. The Internet of Things, which you may have heard a little bit about, is an example of physical computing, that objects, normally inanimate objects in your home, can communicate with one another. Your car can tell you when it's time for an oil change. Maybe your toothbrush makes an appointment with the dentist. Your Apple Watch might communicate with your cardiologist. This is the macaroni and cheese dash button, that if I press this button, macaroni and cheese will be delivered to my house. It's only a matter of time before your closet knows you're out of macaroni and cheese, or your refrigerator knows that the milk is sour, or your washing machine orders more detergent. But now kids can be playing with these ideas as well as it becoming a reality in their life. And computer programming is the 3rd game changer, not just because kids have a vocational payoff, that they might be able to get a high-paying job, but because computer programming is an essential liberal art in the 21st century. It gives kids agency over an increasingly complex and technologically sophisticated world. Schools have gone to great lengths and effort to justify not teaching kids how to program. And we need to do something about that. So, as educators, as citizens, as parents, it's incumbent upon us to identify trends that can reinforce what we've always hoped would happen in education, or sustain what we already do, that can provide new materials and inspiration for what we do, and to offer a counter-narrative to the current direction that we might be heading in. 10 years ago, Make magazine started being published. It was sort of a cross between Popular Mechanics and Wired. It recognized that we could re-energize timeless craft traditions of knitting and sewing and crocheting and carpentry and gardening, and sort of kick it up a notch with these fabrication, physical computing, and programming technologies that allows you to do more things, more efficiently, more interestingly, more powerfully. And soon after Make magazine began being published, the folks who read it and were self-declared makers said, wouldn't it be great if we could come together and show off? And the first Maker Faire happened 10 years ago, and at a Maker Faire you might see giant mouse traps and cupcake cars and formal and informal instruction in soldering and welding and knitting and crocheting and drone warfare. My wife took a class in lock picking at Maker Faire. And everywhere you look, there are kids and adults learning together. Now, lest you think this is some sort of newfangled Renaissance festival, the San Mateo Maker Faire in California had 150,000 attendees. Rome just had 120. New York in September had 100,000. And when we went to our first Maker Faire, we fully expected that parents would tell us their kids are bored in school. That comes as no surprise. What surprised us was the unanimity with which parents told us things like, school is killing my child. And then they would say, look what they can do, and no one gives a damn. The kids are doing all of this stuff in the time they can find between homework and sleep, and yet school is treating them like they're incompetent imbeciles or potential felons. And we need to recognize this, and that's one of the reasons why I'm engaged in the work that I'm doing and why we've written books, etc. There are kids who are at the center of this revolution. This is a really exciting thing. They're beloved and cherished and heralded, not just because they're cute and precocious, but because they know stuff and they have demonstrable expertise. And they, in turn, like being in the company of adults because adults have wisdom and experience and driver's licenses and other resources that are useful to them. Kane of Kane's Arcade, who became internationally famous for having to go to work at his father's junkyard for the summer, and when he got bored, started making an arcade out of cardboard, and someone made a video that went viral on the web, and half of Los Angeles showed up for his arcade one day, and $500,000 was raised for a college fund. And what's great about these kids is they're normal kids. They're not stage managed. In most cases, their parents are astounded by their level of passion, commitment, and fame. And in Kane's case, when he turned 11, he told Brian Williams on NBC that he was retiring, and no one has heard from him since. He just went back to being 11. After the mayor of Los Angeles gave him a cardboard key to the city, and Tony Hawk took him skateboarding, and he was the keynote speaker for the Chick-fil-A franchisees conference. He just said, yeah, that was fun. Now I'm going to ride my bike. And kids who have started electronics companies and such. And we'll talk about one of my colleagues in a moment. So making is a stance. It's a way of viewing the world with the confidence and competence that I can solve any problem that I confront, even if only to discover that there's a lot more that I need to learn. As educators, we need to be preparing kids to solve problems that we never anticipated. We want kids to be mathematicians and historians and engineers and scientists rather than being taught math or science or history or engineering. We want them to have authentic experiences because we believe that knowledge is a consequence of experience. And I like to say that the best makerspace is between your ears. There's a vulgar trend in schools around the world where instead of changing classroom practice, they're breaking ground and building a specialized bunker that the kids are going to visit every couple of weeks to touch the 3D printer. Just like we made the mistake 35 years ago when we put microcomputers in schools and we created computer labs. I want making and its ethos and its materials in every corner of the school available to kids through as much of the time of the school day as possible and beyond. Because we're trying to empower kids to solve their own problems, not have to wait around for an opportunity to touch the stuff. Now, having said that, there are wonderful things happening in maker spaces in communities where people are sharing tools. I recognize that some of the equipment is expensive, it needs to be ventilated and secured. That's fine. But wonderful things are happening with teachers who have their maker space in a tub, and it becomes a classroom center that's available to kids regularly. And we have a choice between the kind of view of school reform that talks about differentiated instruction and racing to the top and getting everyone to the same finish line as long as we crush all the kids behind us, and achievement and backward design, and the maker community, which has kind of an ethos of being student-centered, of honoring serendipity and creativity, of desiring kids to be lost in the flow of what they're doing. One of the ways to think about the Maker Faire and to recognize its significance is that the difference between a Maker Faire and a science fair is a Maker Faire has no competition. I was telling John Becker earlier that the Pinewood Derby is popular in Boy Scouts and kids build little cars to go down tracks, and the number one criticism of Pinewood Derby is always he cheated, right? His father has a laser-powered lathe, and the maker community created something called the Nerdy Derby, which says, cheat. You want to put a rocket on the thing? Fine. We're going to give a prize for the most pieces across the finish line, and the fastest car, and the slowest car, the most hilarious calamity. And more kids are able to participate, and the engineering experiences are richer, that they just sort of flip the script a little bit. That we're teaching to liberate and amplify, as opposed to compete and win. Now, these ideas are not new, that we should be using authentic tools and materials, that we need to open school to the community, that we need to honor expertise, that we need to value the whole child. In fact, these are direct quotes from a book written a century ago by Angelo Petri, who was an Italian immigrant to New York City who became a school teacher and a principal. The book was recently republished. It's the best $10 you'll ever spend. It identifies and solves every single problem in education. And he wrote it 100 years ago. Now, when kids are making things, they're concretizing learning experiences. We know that learning by doing is powerful. Learning by making is a way of making connections and using all of our senses and our whole being in learning something. And I think there's even a higher level of consciousness that's associated with making something work, that when you bend the materials to your will, when you get the computer or some other material to do something that it doesn't do naturally, there's a euphoria associated with that experience, even when it goes catastrophically wrong. Right? Think about 5-year-olds building block towers. They don't cry when 3 hours of tower building collapse. They laugh hysterically. I've got a little $80 drone that you can program on an iPad. And when you write the program for the drone and you tell it to turn right 90 instead of right 180, it doesn't come back. It smacks into the wall and crashes. I assure you, hilarity ensues. Right? There's not a sense of failure. The best projects push up against the persistence of reality. Here's a little video clip of 2 6th graders in Los Angeles working with Lego. Watch the blonde kid. See how the audio, check the audio level. So this kid yells out like a boss in the middle of class and jumps up, smacks his hands together a few times with no sense of self-consciousness about doing this because he's completely lost in the flow of what he's engaged in. We continuously interrupt kids in school and never let them work on anything long enough to get good at it, and then we have the audacity to classify them as attention deficit disorder and such. If you also notice the kids around him, none of them taking any notice of the outburst because they're also equally engaged in what they're doing. So I believe that making things is better than being passive, but that making good things is even better. And my colleague and mentor, Seymour Papert, who helped Piaget understand how children learn mathematics, went on to be the father of educational computing. In our book, we posit that he's kind of the grandfather maker movement. He said that if you make things with computers, you can make more interesting things. You can learn a lot more by making them. That's not to say that the computer is integral to all these experiences, but it supercharges a great number of them. What making adds to a good, progressive, creative, loving, child-centered school is enhanced expressiveness. So one of the mistakes that early childhood educators make is thinking that all screens are created equally. There's a fundamental difference, a profound difference between the way I use computers with children and the way you use an iPad to shut your kid up in Applebee's. One is active, one is passive. And one of the reasons why I like the Reggio Emilia approach is that they have a mature way of looking at technology, that it's irresponsible to build pens around children. We should embrace their world and find constructive ways to do it. And if a kid can build a puppet out of a Pop-Tart box, why can't it sing or dance or call its grandmother? If the means exist for kids to do that kind of work now. It adds precision to the process, where kids are dealing with computation and with measurement and repetitive, predictable results in a way that an engineer would. It allows us to create real things, and we make complexity accessible. That we're working with first graders today who are dealing with geometric ideas that would traditionally be introduced in 10th grade. And they were doing so in a playful, natural fashion. So these new tools are wholly consistent with our best notions of childhood. This is a photograph I took 5 years ago at Maker Faire of the robot petting zoo. Parents waited for their turn for their toddlers to spend a few minutes in the pen with these 3D printed robots that burped and beeped and squawked and ran away and blew bubbles. And if you watch these toddlers interact with the robots, their behavior was indistinguishable from had there been chickens and roosters or cows or kittens in that pen. It reminds us of something that Alan Kay, who invented the personal computer, said, which is that technology is anything that wasn't there when you were born. Technology is anything that wasn't there when you were born. For kids, this stuff isn't hard and worthy of study, and we need to build upon what they know and their lack of fear to allow them to go further than they could discover on their own. So what does this stuff look like in practice? I've probably been talking too long, but I'm going to share a few examples. The first example is actually in the adult world, and it comes from a PBS series, Scientific American Frontiers, with Alan Alda. And Alda is visiting Neil Gershenfeld, a professor at the MIT Media Lab, who about a dozen years ago wrote a book called Fab, in which he predicted that the next major innovation in technology wasn't going to be faster processors or better versions of PowerPoint. It was going to be desktop manufacturing, personal fabrication. The idea that in the past, if you wanted to buy a watch for your father's birthday, you had to get off work in time to get to the shop, hope they had what you wanted in stock, exchange currency for it, wait till you saw your father or drive a great distance. Now you can go online, order the watch, have it delivered to your father. Gershenfeld said that in the very near future, for what a school paid for its first microcomputer, you could have a little factory on a desktop that would allow you to find the best 2 or 3 watches you like, combine the features of them, put a picture of the grandchildren on the face, and email the watch to your father. And when he received the email, he could print the watch out himself and wear it. So Gershenfeld is being visited by Alan Alda looking at this idea, and just for the sake of being historically accurate, all the prices they cite you can divide by 100 today. This video is about 8 years old.
My sister actually was emailing this bicycle in Sydney and she's riding one around. Are you kidding? No, seriously.
Isn't that incredible? So wait a minute, so that means that if I order a bike from a company someday, it won't come in a truck. It'll come, everybody will have one of these machines, and a lot of them will be ordered. Lamps, furniture, bicycles will get emailed to us. We'll have it a few seconds later.
The only thing wrong in what you said is it's not when you order the bicycle, it's when you design the bicycle. And you design the bicycle. Did you recognize what this is? This is actually a model of a Texas Bluetooth number 2. You can see the leg here, the hind leg, another leg here on the thigh, the arch at the back, the head, and the hand holding the front wheel. In this How to Make Anything project, it's not just that students learn to make a bicycle, they learn to make their bicycle. Every bicycle is different, and part of expressing yourself in the bicycle you want is what this is all about.
Okay, all right, this will be great. Listen, work on that thing for me.
So, off I went on what is certainly the first nude bicycle.
So hopefully we're reversing a generation or two of helplessness and consumerism. That when you want something, you have the ability to make it yourself. And if you can't get your head around the idea of emailing a nude bicycle to your holiday destination and printing it when you arrive, let's consider the educational implications of this for a moment. This not only blurs the artificial boundaries between subject areas and dissolves the distinctions between what we consider art and science and technology, humanities and engineering, but once and for all, I hope, it begins to obliterate the destructive cleavage between what we consider vocational and academic education. Because when the same tools, techniques, materials, procedures are required and found in the physics lab, the auto shop, and the art studio, we can stop sorting kids into winners and losers. I have 3 adult university-educated children. The only one who has had gainful employment in her own apartment every day since she graduated was the art major. I have 2 friends who are television carpenters. They make 7 figures building things on TV like tree houses. I bet their guidance counselor didn't tell them that was a career option. I have a brother-in-law, Joe, who dropped out of high school. He went to high school with me and he's my age, which meant he was in my class, but I didn't know him in high school because dropping out of my high school was like a Bigfoot sighting. It just didn't happen. I mean, how hard could it have been? I got out. But he had some family issues and he dropped out of high school, and his life has followed a predictable trajectory. He's struggled to make ends meet. He's got 2 kids, my beloved nephews, one who just started college, one who will go in 2 years. He works in an auto body place. And we were walking around Maker Faire a couple of years ago, and he was marveling at the technological wizardry of the laser cutters and the 3D printers and the microcontrollers. And then he got kind of melancholy for a moment, and he said, yeah, but you know, my kid's school will never be able to afford any of this stuff. And what I was able to say to him with a reasonable degree of certainty is, your kid's school already has this stuff. The problem is your university-bound kids will never see that wing of the building. And traditionally, a school like this would never have those opportunities available because the kids here are the winners and they're not the ones who work with their hands. And the future is going to require all kids to be able to work with their head, heart, and hands equally, to be able to solve their own problems, to make the thing they need to get the job done. My daughter, who's working as an artist for an online sign company, she's doing web design, she's managing teams in India, she writes manuals, she's doing a whole bunch of things. And every time she draws something, her superiors ask, where did you buy that? She says, no, I made it. And they kind of marvel at the fact that they actually have someone who can do something. The best thing we could do is prepare kids to be able to do things. That's the only assessment question we need to ask is, what can you do? And so if kids who have been traditionally academically successful don't have these kinds of experiences, they're going to be as great a disadvantage as kids who have been traditionally academically unsuccessful. So I want to introduce you to my friend and colleague, super awesome Sylvia. She's a kid who at 6 or 7 began going to her first maker fairs. She fell in love with engineering and do-it-yourself projects and technology and wanted to share what she knew with others. When she was 8, she began making a series of videos that she modestly called Super Awesome Sylvia's Super Awesome Maker Show. And she's had a couple million views. She just turned 14. She's in the 9th grade now. And I just want to share a couple minutes of her video, and because I showed it to kids earlier today, but I didn't give them the payoff that I'm hoping to share with you. I've heavily edited this video. She's going to be explaining this open source microcontroller called an Arduino board. It looks like this. It's being used by hobbyists and professionals alike, everything from controlling factories to making robots, to building interactive puppet shows, to controlling gardens, to watering plants. It's got inputs and outputs, so it can detect information from sensors, get stimuli, and turn things on based on it. And in this case, she's talking about how you could build an adjustable strobe to conduct your own science experiments. I edited the video for time. It's still a little too long, but I think you'll enjoy it. And then we'll look at some more examples of what kids and teachers are doing with this stuff.
She built, we will need an Arduino and a connected. We'll be using the dual millimeter 328, a computer and a USB cable to upload to the Arduino, a bright LED. I chose blue because it's cool, but you can use any color you want. And finally, a potentiometer, if you have one. You can make this without it, but it's cooler with one. First, take your Arduino and push the LED into pin 13 and ground. Now it's time for SmartBot's Thinking Lab, where we try to explain how things work. LEDs, or magnetic diodes, are really just diodes that emit light. Electricity will only flow through them in one direction. When electricity flows in the right direction, you get light. Hi. Now take your potentiometer, take the first lead and plug it into 5 volts. Now take the last lead and attach it to ground. 1. Then take the middle lead and push that into one of the analog pins. I chose pin 2 because it's the coolest of the analog pins. I'm cool. This allows you to very carefully send a voltage between 0 and 5 volts to analog pin 2. This value is read by the Arduino as a number between 0 and 1023. Then using a little math, this number becomes the delay value for our strobe. Now we take the source code available at tn42.com/strobe, upload it to the Arduino. Now that our code is compiled and uploaded, we can experiment. Here's one of my test pans. We remove the front grill so we can see it better. Now we just turn on the Arduino
So that's 8. Now, for no other reason, it's certainly better than making a PowerPoint presentation on a topic you don't care about for an audience you're never going to meet. I asked the kids today, how many of you use the World Wide Web to get an answer to a question or learn how to do something, and all the hands went up, and I said, how many of you have put anything there to help someone else? Right, there's sort of an ethic of being able to share what you know with other people, and Sylvia has done that. But there's this one moment I want to talk about. And she's in Girl Scouts, and she nearly flunked 8th grade, and she's got 3 little siblings. She's just a regular kid. She's a delightful kid. I brought her to Australia, and we did a 10-day speaking tour. And had I known, I wouldn't have told her anyway. The first thing I had arranged turned out to be a speech to 4,000 teachers. And then the next day, I took her to a school where they had her teach 7 consecutive classes. But I think lots of kids could do things like that. There's a moment in that video, though, I want to focus on where she talks about the way you get the light to pulse at a certain rate is by sending a voltage between 0 and 5 volts through it. And the way you communicate that voltage is by using a number between 0 and 1023 in your program. And then she matter-of-factly says, and then using a little math, you can determine the delay value for the strobe. That's the entire K-9 math curriculum in that problem. I was working in Arkansas a couple months ago, and I was able to say, there's a pretty good chance there's no one in this state who was engaged in mathematics that sophisticated that day in any classroom anywhere. And if a kid had that experience, they truly understand a lot more than what we expect. And if our goals are no more modest than improving achievement in the existing math curriculum, we would teach kids how to program. It's one of the only authentic contexts for using the stuff we teach them in math class. Otherwise, much of it is just vocabulary exercise. And she's been to the White House a few times, and that's where with Massimo Bonzi invented Arduino and speaking at Maker Faire and in the Australian newspaper. But I have to tell you, school was no picnic. If she got invited to the UN to speak on girls and technology at a conference in Geneva, or to go to the White House 3 times, her school punished her for missing the worksheet, because it's not fair to the children who did the worksheet. And she published her first book last year, her super simple Arduino book, and she was too embarrassed to share it with her teachers, probably because they've never written or published anything. I mean, and over and over again, I meet kids like this, where school is completely ignoring them. I work in a wonderful, loving, happy, independent school in Los Angeles, and last year, one day, the head of school announced that Wilson was my intern. Wilson was a 10-year-old. They decided they could either throw him out or make him my intern. And my goal for Wilson before the end of the year was for Wilson to do 2 consecutive things. I failed. Getting Wilson to do 1 consecutive thing was difficult. But in about 10 seconds, I found out that Wilson played the cello. None of Wilson's teachers knew he played the cello. That's kind of important for a kid who you think can't focus. And it sort of, makes me sad that no one knew that simple, important part of Wilson's life. And it amazed the teachers that I never bothered to ask them what was wrong with him, because I didn't care. I just treated Wilson like a human being and did the best job I could with him. But I can tell you that if I had spent more time with him, knowing that he was a cellist, there would have been opportunities for me to enrich his education in ways that weren't being met. Kids can program in environments that result in beautiful art with simple block programming. And they can turn that art into patterns, which they can crop and then convert the file to a design format and open in free 3D design software like Tinkercad and extrude the 2D image and make it 3D, and then send that to the 3D printer and get these cookie cutters and then play with it with Play-Doh and then stamp it in ceramic clay. And then when you fire them and hand paint them, you get these beautiful works of art. Now, what I love about this is 3 things. 1, in the time it took me to share that with you, you know how to do it. 2, we're going from the screen to something tangible. We're going from the digital to analog. And 3, we're going from mathematics to art. I know there are some teachers who have an Escher painting in their classroom and they tell the kids that there's math in that and no one really believes them or knows what the math is. But in this case, you couldn't create something that intricate or beautiful without starting with mathematical ideas. These kids built a marimba out of PVC pipe and wood. They told me they were inspired by Blue Man Group. They were in Vermont. I asked them if they had seen Blue Man Group. They told me no, and if I had had one more day there, I would have rented a car and driven them to Boston. But they figured out that in order to reproduce the pitch that they wanted, there was a mathematical calculation based on the diameter of the tube and the frequency of the note you wanted. And they told me that while they were capable of doing that math, they didn't think some of their classmates were, and they wanted to include their classmates in the project. So they did something really empathetic, or maybe it was just an example of hubris. They wrote a program in Scratch that asked, what's the frequency you want, how long is the tube, and then it calculated and told you how long to cut it. Which was really terrific because they were using programming in an instrumental fashion. The program wasn't the final product, it was something that led to a marimba. And they composed songs for it, and they could play it. And after several hundred adoring parents told, teachers at this conference told them how brilliant they were, I walked up behind them and said, hey, it seems like kind of a drag that I have to go through all these pages of lookup tables to find the frequency of the note that I want and put that. Why can't I type B flat into the program? And these two boys just went, oh, and grabbed their laptop and ran away. And the teacher was emailing me for a week that they were working on this problem. That's because I knew it was possible, and I knew it was within their zone of proximal development. I knew it was close enough, it was within reach of them making the program better. I meet a lot of teachers who buy all this maker stuff, and they're really enthusiastic, and they love their kids, and they say, the kids are so amazing, they figured out how to do all this stuff without me, you can't believe what they know how to do, I don't have to know anything. And I often respond, you know what would be even better? If you knew something. Because then you could help them, because then you could throw a well-timed obstacle in their way that creates a bug that they have to think through, because then you know who they can call or what website they can go to or what book they can read to be able to learn something more. When we make simple things possible, when we make simple things easy to do, we make complexity possible. No one accuses those of you wearing glasses of cheating. Right? We use technology all the time to go about our daily lives. Conrad Wolfram has been talking about the fact that we're spending 20,000 student lifetimes a year on manual mathematical calculations that I could answer by speaking to my Apple Watch. That's a real challenge, that's a real provocation for schools. Not just about how they teach, but the what they teach. And when a kid is able to solve the problem that they want to solve when they need to solve it, they're encouraged to learn much more sophisticated things. So there are project ideas everywhere that can honor serendipity, that can allow kids to succeed at their level. So here's an example. I was working in El Dorado, Arkansas, a community with a median household income of $28,000 a year. And this was actually in the hallway, not as a piece of nostalgic kitsch. It's functional. You put a buck in, you get a pencil. There's a member of faculty who reloads it and collects the money. I was astonished by this. And they were looking for maker projects. I said, here's one for you. Make preposterous vending machines and line the hallways with them. So I was doing a workshop in Fredonia, New York. Yes, it's a real place. Hail, hail, Fredonia, land of the brave and free. And I said, make a vending machine. And these teachers went about, and in a couple hours, every group of teachers had made some sort of vending machine. One group had a stuffed giraffe, and they wanted to make the giraffe puke gumballs. They wanted to have it vomit gumballs. Well, it turned out puking gumballs is hard, but pooping them is easy. Leads to some really interesting connections. Maybe that's evolutionary. Maybe there's a reason why we get, gravity and babies and pooping and things like that. It's mechanically easier to get something through a system by relying on gravity. There's no curriculum on Earth that could have predicted that. It just came out of this whimsical activity. There are no toy problems even if we're playing with toys. I am obsessed by the question as an educator of what's the smallest seed I could plant that grows the largest flower, that creates the most beautiful garden. There's nothing better than writing a prompt on a Post-it note that inspires kids for 3 months. And we could talk about this in a workshop setting and forever, but the best projects are the ones that everyone can succeed at. Everyone knows what a vending machine is, so there's no wrong answer. And a beginner creates one that drops gumballs out of a stuffed animal, and others have coin boxes and can determine whether it's a nickel or a dime, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you ask kids to build something that climbs a ramp, everyone knows what that means, and people will do it at various levels of complexity depending on their own individual ability and experience and expertise. But everyone can have a piece of the action. 5 years ago, I went to the Enchanted Tiki Room at Disneyland for the first time. I had been to Disneyland 1,000 times, but the only reason you go to the Enchanted Tiki Room is when it's 105 degrees outside and the lines for the good rides are too long. And while I was in the Enchanted Tiki Room, the birds that come down and sing and dance, I turned to my colleague, who I now share an office with, and said, we're that close to being able to do this with kids. Oh my God. Within a couple of years, we'll be able to do this with kids. And now using a kit that they have here called the Hummingbird Robotics Kit, I was able to say to a group of teachers in Arkansas, build birds that sing and dance. And so there's a little chassis and an apparatus and a Coke bottle. We're recycling, we're upcycling, we're repurposing materials. It's sustainable, it's green. And teachers were doing things like making that bird or this bird. And in this case, they downloaded audio, they edited it. In a traditional professional development setting, that would have been a semester just to do the audio piece. This happened in 3 minutes because it was en route to doing something that mattered to them. Here's a beautiful bird that didn't work too well, but looked cool. Here's one shaking its tail feathers. Here's one that had a proximity sensor that knows how close you are. And one of the skills you need to be able to program that is recognizing what kind of data is the sensor giving me and what's the threshold for triggering close. I'm not giving anything away or being unprofessional if I tell you at least one of the teachers in this group wasn't quite sure about greater than or less than. She couldn't remember if the crocodile's mouth went this way or that way. Right? So there's no actual mathematical understanding there. It's just trying to remember a trick. Well, in this case, she understood greater than or less than better than she had in 40 years. And the mathematics involved is critical to 1,000,001 engineering challenges and problems in life, and yet it's divorced from most kids' educational experiences. And it results in something like this. Group of teachers that worked at my summer institute a couple of years ago decided they wanted to build a system that would water a plant when it got thirsty. How do you know if a plant is thirsty? Well, if you put 2 nails connected to wires and an Arduino in the soil, when the soil is moist, the resistance is lower than when it's dry. Once they had that working, they built a chassis out of Lego that would lift the bottle up and pour water. Once they got that to work, they decided they wanted to have water when it was dark out, because you don't want to waste the water, have it evaporate. And they built this incredibly elaborate, precise, reproducible machine. None of them had any previous experience with these materials. They taught at every conceivable grade level. They were from several different countries. But then they showed me something that took my breath away. They said that once they determined how far apart the nails should be, they sketched a nail separator and 3D printed the part they needed. 1 year earlier, we had a 3D printer at the same event, and people looked at it like a chimp discovering fire. In a 12-month period, it just became something you draw a picture and then print out what you need. I'll skip that really quickly. So what about the curriculum? I don't want to keep you here all night. This looks like fun and games, summer camp. Some of you might just dismiss this as whimsy. I think whimsy is a really powerful context for learning, as is beauty and meaning and purpose, and whether your project is shareable and whether someone gives a damn about what you've done, or you care about the work yourself. But what about the curriculum? There's some stuff we have to teach. So how about fractions? This is a little piece of nonsense we torture kids with for several years. I was working at a school in Los Angeles where learn numerator and denominator was on the whiteboard for so long you could no longer erase it. You could chip it off, but it wasn't going anywhere. It was on the whiteboard literally for 8 months. And what really bugged me about that was you have a 50-50 chance of being right? So I walked into the class and said, the first kid who writes a program that allows me to type any fraction into the computer and draws me a graphical representation of that fraction as parts of a circle, I'll take you out to lunch. Wasn't sure if I was allowed to do that. Kid said, can we work together? I said, sure. 2 days later, 3 10-year-old girls handed me this program, which sure enough lets me type complex fractions in and draws me graphical representations of it as part of a circle. And what really burns me up is, otherwise, this is just a damn vocabulary exercise. Here they're dealing with numerator and denominator, they're dealing with angle measure and radius and iteration and variable and a whole bunch of other concepts. The entire program is like a dozen lines of code. This is something 10-year-olds can do. And if kids had that experience in 2 days, they're accomplishing more than they might be doing in 2 years in school. I met a teacher and principal in the bush in Australia last year. They brought me a video that they were really proud of. And I'm thrilled that they were proud of their student and really touched by their generosity and how much they respect what their kid had created. And they said this kid calls himself a steampunk. And he makes these machines in his spare time and sometimes brings them to school, but he has really low literacy skills. And he makes things that look like this. So what could be better than compressed gas, open flames, and sharp objects? What could possibly go wrong? And while I was really impressed and touched by the fact that they were proud of this kid's work and willing to share it with me, I was a little concerned that they were using the fact that he was good at making things like this as a way of dismissing the fact that he wasn't so good at literacy. And call me a crazy radical, I think literacy is a good idea. But I then asked a series of questions, which I thought were rather simple, like, does your school have a subscription to Make or any computer magazines? Has he read Jules Verne? My doctoral research was involved in creating a high-tech, alternative, project-based learning environment inside a prison for teenagers, a place where Amnesty International documented kids were being tortured. And we had kids working 5 hours a day, uninterrupted on personally meaningful projects. And that experience suggested to me that I could get this kid to read Jules Verne in 10 minutes. When you might not be able to get your AP English kids to read it. And if he read Jules Verne, or Richard Feynman, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, that kid would then be part of the literacy club. He would learn to read in the same 100 hours it takes a 5-year-old to read under the right conditions. And this is the slide that everyone in the maker movement shares with every audience such as yourself. For those of you who think that this is summer camp, this is the slide of the headline announcing that last year MIT, arguably the best math and science institution in the world, added a maker portfolio to their undergraduate admissions application. And the vice president of admissions at MIT has been going to maker fairs all over the world, telling parents, we want your kids. Now, why? If you're applying to MIT, you're probably good at math and science. Just a guess. You probably have good test scores. What being a maker demonstrates is an ability and, more importantly, a willingness to solve problems, to make things, to create, to demonstrate your ingenuity without an AP credit or a grade or a gun to your head. That it demonstrates habits of mind that are in a non-coercive setting. It's the differentiator. And I suspect that other schools will follow suit. One of the questions that I'm concerned with is, when do kids get to become good at something? When do they get to work on something longer than a course of an antibiotic? Is deep learning possible? Patry, a century ago, said, I do not remember the school ever staying with a beautiful idea long enough to have it become an important part of children's lives. I'm going to skip this. I can show you some stuff. Skip. But this is a project created by teachers at Constructing Modern Knowledge last summer. They made a dress that responds to noise and lights up or will dance with music. Now, this is, on one hand, a science project or an engineering task. On the other hand, they made a dress. This not only welcomes all sorts of kids into the experience and blurs the boundaries between subject areas, but they made something beautiful, not just technical. And they could discuss how it works and why it works. And they were resourceful enough to find the materials they needed in a strange city to make something beautiful that they would cherish. One of the best pieces of advice I can leave with any educator that I have the privilege of working with or speaking to is less us, more them. Anytime you think you should intervene on behalf of some educational transaction, it's worth asking the question, is there less that I can do and more that they can do? How can we shift maximum agency to the kid? Because that's when they learn the most. This is one of my favorite examples, and we often talk about the reason why we do terrible things to kids is because the parents want it. And this is digital gingerbread house. On the left, so the video on the left was created 15, 16 years ago in the prison for teenagers. That's the work of the most dangerous kids in society. The gingerbread houses that have Christmas trees that spin and carols that play and lights that flash and beds that throw you out when the alarm rings. And then a couple of years ago, I did a similar experience in 5th grade in Los Angeles in an independent school. And I'm not going to tell you that this gets you early admission to Yale. It's kind of a cool thing to do at Christmas time. Kids like it. It's kind of a softer approach to engineering, and you get the benefit of eating it at the end. And I have to share this story with you. When I was working on the project that created the image on the right, the door to my classroom opened up a crack, and I saw the director of admissions pop her head in. I said, come on in. I'm not afraid to have anyone visit my class while I'm working. And she said, I've got a lot of people with me. I said, that's fine. They're welcome as well. And in walked 30 complete strangers. I didn't know this was an admissions tour. And in they walked into this like candy and icing and cookie orgy that was taking place. And they talked to the kids about their work and they observed their projects. And then they left and I didn't think anything of it. And later that day I was walking down the hallway past the administration offices and I heard someone yell, hey, thanks a lot, Stager. Oh God, now what have you done? And the director of admissions came out and I swear to God she said to me, thanks to you, I had to spend over an hour trying to convince those parents that wasn't staged for their benefit. So, wow, what a nice reminder. Maybe parents want happy kids. Maybe, just maybe, when their kids come home from school and they ask, what did you do today? They don't say nothing. Maybe there's an interesting story they can tell that has imbued in it something that they learned, some powerful idea that they came in contact with, some desire to return to school the next day. The last example I'm going to share with you comes from my work at the American School of Bombay. They gave me 60 or 70 10th graders for 3 hours. We introduced them to a number of these technologies. First, we gave every kid an experience with turtle art, the programming environment I showed a couple of minutes ago. And then we said to the kids, you could use makey-makeys and little bits and the 3D printers and wearable computers and Arduino, and you can pick their friends and you can goof around, and you can giggle, you can have a ball. And this one girl, 10th grade girl, sat in the corner by herself programming on her laptop. She had never done any programming before that day. And she sat, I'll tell you about that picture in a minute. Well, I'll tell you about it now. That's a photograph I took at Constructing Modern Knowledge a few years ago of Norm, who was a teacher. And that was the picture we got when we said, no, Norm, you can't take your robot home. And I just love the fact that Norm was sort of reduced to being a 4-year-old in that moment. That we encourage the teachers to take off their teacher hat, put on their learner hat. And you can't help but think that when Norm goes back to his classroom, he's going to think differently about the way he teaches. We've had teachers say things like, I force my kids to work together. Why do I do that? It's stupid. I worked in 5 different groups. I changed project ideas a couple of times. We had one teacher who said, second day of CMK, I was frustrated. I didn't like my group members very much. Our project wasn't working. We had hit a wall. I packed the car. I was ready to go home. I went to get a cup of coffee before I drove away. And as I sat down with my cup of coffee, the solution to our problem came to me. I threw it away. I ran back. My teammates told me they missed me. They were worried about me. I told them about what I thought about to solve our bug, and it worked. And look at the amazing project we created. And I thought, well, that's terrific. She said, no, but that's not the moral of the story. Oh, really? She said, no, the takeaway is, when do my students get to get a cup of coffee? When I tell them to stay on task and sit down and shut up and focus. I know that when I'm doing anything hard, when I'm programming, when I'm stumped, as soon as I turn my back to the computer, the solution comes to me. But we deprive kids of those experiences, of having sufficient time, or being able to breathe, or to get a cup of coffee. So back to this story. So this girl sat for several hours defiantly programming by herself when all of her friends were having a ball and doing all sorts of other things. And finally, she was generous enough to share with us what she had done. And she was programming in Turtle Art, this idea that we're using geometric commands to tell this turtle that has a pen stuck in its belly button to draw on the screen. And when you run the program that she wrote, the turtle drew "I love you" in perfect symmetry and perspective and dimensions. And it sort of takes your breath away and reminds you that sometimes when you're 15, there's more important things on your mind than the Pythagorean theorem. And yet, she was using a ton of mathematics in service of this thing that mattered to her. So, with that, I thank you for your time and the work that you do and your interest in your own children and the kids in your community. I'm happy to take any questions, sign books. I haven't slept in about a week and a half, so why should I start now? Thank you very much, folks. Thank you. Anybody have a question? And if you have to run to your paint houses or do landscaping work or pick up a babysitter or pizza, that's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
What was that conference in July that you started?
Constructing modern knowledge. The concern was an ed tech community that hadn't thought enough about learning and a progressive education community that said silly things every time modernity was mentioned, and trying to build a bridge between them and create a space where people could spend 4 days being uninterrupted in personally meaningful stuff. We shipped 50 cases of materials. And I'm not exaggerating when I say we have beautiful little silly things that are created, but every year people do stuff that 2 years ago would have earned you a PhD and 5 years ago was science fiction. And they do it without instruction. We have an amazing faculty to support people, but we start with a protocol of what do you want to make and then just throw it out. And we have astronomers and jazz musicians and filmmakers and people who are expert at what they do, because I think teachers need to come in contact with what greatness looks like, feels like, smells like, tastes like, treehouse designers, etc. So yeah, constructingmodernknowledge.com. We have team discounts. The school I work with in Los Angeles sends minimum of 6 teachers every summer and has actually made a commitment to sending everyone twice because they recognize the bang for the buck they get. It's really helped sustain their community and create continuous progress. What else besides shameless promotion for events that I'm running? Yes, ma'am.
As a parent, so a student in a high poverty, barely accredited Excel population elementary school, what is one thing that I can do to sort of get them on this path, or
Well, you can start with cardboard. This is something called Make. The question was high poverty school. What can we do to get them on this track? Any of the materials become a pathway to all these kinds of experiences. This is Make Do. It costs next to nothing. It's reusable screws for connecting cardboard and a kid-safe saw and hinges. And so you can make really big, really strong stuff out of cardboard. And then what ends up happening is kids want to make it light up or talk or sing. So it builds a bridge to that stuff. These experiences used to be commonplace in public schools. I used to work in the New York City public schools. There were always hammers and nails and saws and things. And we've removed those experiences. And it's not just because of liability. We've removed all experience from those schools. All the kids do is test prep. All they do is literate. I had a superintendent in Sheridan, Wyoming tell me that their 5 hours a day of direct instruction in nothing but literacy and numeracy was going to prepare kids for the 21st century and make them creative problem solvers. And when I recognized that he lacked all capacity for irony, a cold chill went down my spine. The kids are getting a steady diet of suet in a lot of public schools. So advocating for your kids, saying this stuff is possible, bringing some materials in, trying to create real experiences for them, I think, is a really important idea. And the other idea is that for the first time in history, I think this provides opportunities for some of those parents to have a reciprocal relationship with the school. So the holy grail of school improvement is always about parental engagement. And parental engagement in a lot of schools consists of deputizing parents to enforce your rules. Right? So you have a family math night or literacy night, which is really a sneaky, disingenuous way of getting parents to enforce compliance with your homework rules. And if you're a low socioeconomic status parent, limited English speaker, someone who didn't have a great school experience yourself, you don't find those environments very inviting. But You know how to do stuff and make stuff and fix things. And I have plenty of room for optimism that now we can invite those parents to share their expertise in a way that's beneficial to the kids in the school. One of the maintenance guys at the school that I work in has been teaching woodworking to the kindergartners. The kindergartners spent 2 hours straight making wooden boxes, measuring and cutting and predicting and hammering and sawing, and with a guy who speaks a little bit of English and is good at fixing things. And it also reminded us of something my friend Deborah Meyer likes to say, which is that there's no one with a longer attention span than a little kid. I mean, there's kids out there, right? No one's come in here screaming or begging for their mother, right? There's Lego and people who like them. What else? Yes, in the back.
Know of a network of educators who are teaching pre-service this way or writing about children this way?
I don't know in the pre-service setting, but I know that, for example, there's a hashtag on Twitter that's just hashtag #MakeARed that's really active, and every Tuesday night they have a synchronous chat in Twitter about this stuff, and it's a pretty big community. And Make Magazine has a spin-off nonprofit called MakeARed, and so there's stuff happening, and there's a lot of emphasis on STEM and STEAM. There was a White House Maker Fair, so there's a lot of energy about this behind this. Teacher ed, a lot of us have worked in it, and it's kind of in a bad place right now. One last question. Don't be afraid. Yes, sir.
How do you propose this as a supplement to the ABCs and the math and whatever? Or you propose it as a entirely new multi-curriculum that
I propose it, he asked, is this a supplement to the ABCs and the traditional stuff we've taught? I propose it as an old-fashioned way of teaching and with new materials. We taught like this for centuries. I was telling folks earlier today, when I became an elementary school teacher, back to the teacher ed comment, until 1985, in most places, if you wanted to be an elementary school teacher, you had to learn how to play the piano a little bit, teach science, make puppets, build math manipulatives, teach phys ed. And then legislators all over the world said, hey, teaching ain't nothing. We can give you 5 minutes of instruction in curriculum delivery and animal control and hand you a script. And the result is, frankly, and this isn't a shot at teachers, we've got a generation of really well-educated, well-intentioned, loving teachers who just don't have the art of teaching. They don't know how to do this stuff. So those of us who do, and those of us who remember Cuisinart rods and hamsters and test tubes and hammer and nail and wood and books and puppets in classrooms and baking cookies and singing songs have an obligation to bring that stuff back to our classrooms. Not just for the kids that we teach, but for our colleagues who don't know that it's possible. These are timeless ideas, and in our book, we go back hundreds of years to sort of situate this in a historical context. The difference is that you could do stuff in this spirit in the humanities quite easily. Your kids could write, they could sing, they could act in plays, they could do historical research. But it was really difficult because the technology didn't exist for kids to be mathematicians and scientists and engineers, and now that it does. So, I mean, I got started in education when I was 18 years old. I went to Berklee College of Music on a scholarship. I came home for spring break. I read in the newspaper that the local school board in the community I grew up in, where I fell in love with music and jazz improvisation and composing and played a couple different instruments. I got a scholarship to the conservatory, had voted 9-0 to eliminate school music programs. And 3 days later, I got the vote reversed, and then I formed a nonprofit to make sure it never happened again. I'm as committed to the arts side of this. It's all about experience. I want kids to have rich experiences. I don't want them to waste a minute in the day. I want there to always be something interesting and engaging for them to do. And I think what we're doing is we're adding colors to the crayon box. We're extending the range of materials that are available to make learning interesting and meaningful for kids. Thanks, folks. I'll stick around. I'm happy to talk to you informally.